Go.
I am Janet Gregg Curry Harrison. I was born on the 13th of May in 1933 to Jean and Marjorie Curry. They were wonderful parents. And was brought up in Armonk, New York, which is about 35 miles north of New York City, kind of out in the country. And there were four of us. My sister Meg, 3 years older than I am, our brother Ren, 4 years younger than I am, and our brother Jay, 2 years younger than that. And we started out going to a two-room country school. It was a wonderful experience because we had a marvelous teacher, Nell Bassage, and she really was able to handle the kids very well and teach everybody. It was two rooms. The little room was actually physically bigger, but it was called the little room because it had little kids. And the big room was smaller, but had the big kids. And I remember in the hurricane of 1938, I was 5. I was looking out the living room window because Nell Bassage was going to come and stay with us because it was too far for her to drive home in the hurricane. And I looked out the window. She drove in the driveway. She went right past the place where she usually parked and went on and parked another place because she was going to stay overnight. Right after she went by, a big ash tree fell right where her car was usually parked. That's one of my earliest memories. But this was really a very fine educational start. And our parents were both brought up in Scotch Covenanter families. My father grew up in Kansas, in Winchester, near Winchester, Kansas, and his parents were unusual. They went to Ireland on a honeymoon, and that was unknown for people in their circle of friends. My mother's grandfather and father were medical missionaries in Syria, but her father came back and was a family physician in Philadelphia. And one day, he came back from the hospital and he said, "Margie," that was my mother, "Margie, there's a little Scotch Covenanter girl in the hospital. She's here from Kansas because the buggy turned over and her arm was injured, and her father has brought her here to see if anything can be done," which it could not. But he said, "She's very lonely. Maybe you could go in a couple of afternoons and just, spend some time with her." So my mother went in and she took wooden clothespin dolls, a kind of, not the pinchy wooden ones, but the ones with the round wooden head. And they were dolls, and she took a box, a cardboard box that was shaped like a kitten. So years went by, many years, and my father was at Geneva College, which was a Covenanter college, and my mother was in Beaver Falls visiting Aunt Janet. Her name is spelled like mine, Janet, but it was pronounced Janet. And somehow they met. I'm just not sure how they met. But anyway, they became acquainted and they had a very long, many years courtship. When my father took my mother out to Kansas to meet his family, lo and behold, one of his sisters was the little girl who had been in the hospital. I mean, if you wrote that in a book, it would sound so corny and contrived. But listen, coincidences like that happen all the time. And actually, I think my Aunt Mildred kept that cardboard box for like a kitten many years. And she was fantastic. She never could have full use of her left arm, but she could sew and remodel clothing, and I saw her once lift a turkey with one hand. Just amazing. Well, my mother went to high school. Then she went to Wellesley College, where I went also, and actually I graduated 30 years later than she did, so we sometimes went to reunions together. Well, when I was in the middle of 6th grade, cut that. When we were growing up, you know, we had the usual battles and everything, and I have to say, I always was trying to keep up with Meg. Never could, of course. But we used to play among board games, although we were not allowed to play with dice or cards or sew or go to the movies on Sunday because that was against the Scotch Covenanter policies. But we also played a game called Roll-A-Bat, and that was played on the big lawn. And somebody was a batter, somebody was a pitcher, and whoever else was around was in the field. If the batter hit it, and if 3 strikes and they were out, but if the batter hit it and the person caught it before it landed on the ground, then that person was up and the batter took that person's place. If the person caught it on the first bounce, then the batter put the bat down on the ground and the person who caught it rolled the ball, and if they hit the bat, they were up. When we moved, then when I was in the middle of 6th grade, my father was in the Navy Reserve, and we moved down to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. For World War I, he was too young, and he was refused in America. He was going up to Canada to join. That's in the days when people went to Canada to join up with the Army. But the day, as he was in New York, he spent that night, and the next day he heard the bells of the armistice, so he didn't get in World War I. World War II, he was too old, but he wanted to join, so he joined the reserve and went in as a Lieutenant JG and eventually became a lieutenant commander. When we were in Chapel Hill, he was teaching at the pre-flight school, and he was teaching the regulations and history of the Navy. And we spent 1 year in a professor's house, and then we had a wonderful house. It was the Episcopal rectory because the Episcopal minister was not married and didn't need this great big house. And we actually did become Episcopalians before we went down to Chapel Hill, because the Covenanters do not vote, because although God is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, he's not mentioned in the Constitution. But my father very much wanted to be able to vote, so by then we were Episcopalians. But that was a great house, and we had, to me, Chapel Hill were the golden years. I just loved it, because in Armonk we were out in the country. There was nobody around my age. You had to go someplace all the time. You had to be taken someplace, or you didn't go. And I really loved Chapel Hill because I could walk or bike. The University of North Carolina was much sparser. For one thing, the young women had to go 2 years to a different campus, which I had forgotten, but Meg said that. But there were fewer young men because they were in the service. But there was this whole Navy pre-flight school. And so it was just wealth of things to go to. The Carolina Playmakers, and they had this wonderful amphitheater where we saw Shakespeare plays, and there were sports and parades, and we went to the chapel service with the Navy. They would march with a band. Of course, it was very stirring. They'd march down the street, and the Catholics would peel off to go to the Catholic church, but the Protestants would all go to one church. And to hear all those men together say the Lord's Prayer and sing the Navy hymn was just thrilling. It just was wonderful. The schools were not very good. In fact, they were pretty darn poor. But there was one wonderful teacher. Elizabeth Sewell was the 8th grade English teacher. And she made up for a lot of the others. Her father was a state judge. She didn't have to teach, but she loved to teach, and she was good at it. One time, she read a story, and we had to finish And then after we had handed our papers in, then she read the end of the story. One time when I was up in Vermont, long after I graduated from college, I was visiting a college friend of mine, and her husband, they were both ministers, and her husband was blind. And I said, well, I'll take you to preach at this church. He was a visiting preacher, because I've never heard you preach. So I took him, and he was up being shown, or being told where the pulpit was, and so on and so forth. And I was standing in the aisle, and a very nice lady was sitting in a pew, and she said to me, would you like to sit with me? And I said, yes, I would. We started talking, and I asked her about a certain kind of tree that I had seen in Vermont. And she said, well, I really don't know because I'm not from here. And it turned out she was from Chapel Hill. And when I said, did you have Elizabeth Sewell for 8th grade English? She said, oh, yes, wasn't she wonderful? So there's another coincidence. I just happened to sit with her. So anyway, the schooling wasn't all that great. We were there from the middle of 6th grade to the end of my 8th grade. And I remember the first week standing in line, in the lunch line, and a girl from the country said something to me, and I didn't understand her southern accent. She said it again. I still didn't understand. Well, she said it the third time, and I was too ashamed to admit that I hadn't. So I just kind of tried to bluff it. But by the time we had been there 2.5 years, I had kind of a southern accent also. Now, when we went back to New York, to our home, we went in a different direction than all the kids, really, that we had gone to elementary school with. We went to Pleasantville High School. And in many ways, we were second-class citizens because we came from Armonk and had to be bused. In the morning, the girls would ride in one bus, and we sang songs and we harmonized. It sounds quaint. In the afternoon, you came home on a mixed bus, but if you really wanted to do anything at all, any kind of activity, you had to get the late bus, which was always called the football bus, so you know what the emphasis was there. And I hardly knew anybody. And I was very shy. For one thing, I was 2 years younger than most people, and I didn't know people. And somebody told me years later that they had thought I was Chinese because I had straight dark hair, straight bangs, kind of a sallow complexion, and I didn't talk to anybody. Well, I gradually learned to talk and became very active, and then went on to Wellesley, where I was an English major. And in my, nice group of friends from college. In my senior year, I met James L. Harrison, MD. I met him because he was in a pathology residency at Boston City Hospital, and one of his fellow pathologists was a woman who graduated from Wellesley, and her husband had classic old movies. And so some of the guys came out to Wellesley on Friday nights and would show these movies. And I was sitting on the end of a row, and they had some really boring short on the cotton industry. And Jim was going back and forth, adjusting lights and so on. And so I probably said something like, hey, when will this be over and Shangri-La will begin? He said, I don't know, but I'll find out. And he went back and he found out there was only about 5 minutes left. And he sat down and, we chatted a bit, and we chatted after the movie. And I was wearing my elegant sneakers on which I had painted red toenails. His big come on was, would you like to see an autopsy? And I said, oh yes, that would be interesting. And so it turned out that they did they subcontracted doing autopsies at various small hospitals. And so I saw quite a few autopsies, but we had other dates as well. Our first date, in fact, was going to a concert at Wellesley. And then we sat outside and talked for quite a while. That was We met on the 5th of December in 1952. And by Valentine's Day, we had decided we wanted to get married. And then then Meg was going to get married Meg and I were going to go on a trip to Europe that our parents had given us as kind of a graduation present. A neat thing, you know, you go in a group and you stop one day in a country and the next day it's some other country and so on, but it was great. However, Don Gregg had gone off to the islands before he and Meg had really known that they wanted to get married. And then he came back and asked her to marry him. So they got married on July 4th, and she did not go on that trip. She went back with him, but I went on that trip and had a wonderful time, and then came back, and Jim and I were married on September 27th, 1953, which is the exact same date that Jack and Jackie Kennedy were married. And we moved up to an apartment on Jamaica, fourth floor apartment, walk up in Jamaica Plain at the end of the elevated train. And it was also, you could look out and see the what's now Amtrak. Then it was called the Shoreline or something like that. And in fact, one time when I'd been visiting my parents, Jim knew what train I was going to come on, and I sat on the side of the train where I could see our apartment, and he leaned out the window and waved to me. It was really fun. And we had lots of cats. We had a black cat. We had a wonderful male coon cat called Kibble Baby. We had lots of cats, and then we had kittens. And we painted the house. On our honeymoon, we stayed in the apartment, and we painted the house and put together a hi-fi set, and my soldering wells stayed very tight, whereas some other people's did not go as well. And so we had this wonderful hi-fi, and we painted the rooms in kind of soft Williamsburg colors. And there was a long hallway, and on the long blank wall of the hallway, I painted a tree using the colors of the rooms, and then I had 4 or 5 bright red apples hanging on it. And some of the cats that we had would jump up for the apples, and the lady underneath us said that the cats were very noisy. She stayed home all day, and she said the cats were very noisy because they would chase each other up and down the hallway. So we tried, you know, what can you do with cats? You can't, I've seen them trained to walk on a tightrope, but the only time I've ever been able to train cats is they come when the can opener was going. Anyway, she brought up a lot of scatter rugs for us to put in the hallway. Well, the cats still chased each other. I think then we'd come home and the rugs would kind of be bunched up at the end of the hall, so I think they just kind of slid on the rugs anyway. But it was fun. We had lots of cats. And Jim worked 96 to 120 hours a week at the hospital, every other night and every other weekend on duty. He was paid peanuts, but of course he had food because he was there. I taught for 1 year at a private school. I taught art and assisted in the nursery school. And then after that, I taught special ed in the Braintree public schools. They had divided a class. I only had about 8 kids, and they were educable. And I was hired on the basis that the superintendent said, well, they're not head-minded, they're hand-minded. You know, that was crazy. But nonetheless, I was hired to teach them, and while I was teaching, I went on weekends and summers and went to Boston University and got a Master of Education degree. And then after a couple of years of being married, I was pregnant, but we lost that baby. And then it took about another year to get pregnant again. It gave me more of an, I mean, people then, because, in those days, it was illegal to sell contraception. So in those days, what you heard more about were people who were having babies unexpectedly. But it gave me more of an understanding of couples who want to get pregnant and are having a difficult time. But finally we got pregnant again, and just in time to move down to Drexelbrook. Jim, for those years, he had been in the general surgery program at Boston City Hospital, and he wanted to do thoracic surgery as his very good friend Bob Litwack, who was also at Hahnemann Medical College, also was at Boston City Hospital, and was then also down in Philadelphia, although with a different doctor than Jim was following. And so we had 3 years in Philadelphia while he got his thoracic training. And we had Abby on September 27th, 1957, and we had Slater on February 27th, 1959. 17 months apart, lots of diapers. But it was nice. We lived in a garden apartment collection of homes. There were 3 people there, 3 men who were in residency, medical residency programs, and one was with the Navy. Every month, at the end of the month, he would bring home the sea rations that had gone out of date. And that's what we ate, the end of the month. We ate sea rations. They were very ugly. They were in dark olive green cans with black lettering, no pictures, no color. But, you know, they were free and we needed them at that time. It's good, you know, it's okay to be poor when you have some hope of things getting better. And we did. After when he was finishing his residency, and he was still on every other night and every other weekend, when he was finishing, there was a medical student from Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and they were saying, you know, well, what are you going to do next year, and so on and so forth. And this man said, well, you really ought to go up to Williamsport. There's nobody doing what you're doing. And so Jim went up by himself, talked to, in fact, the medical student had told the hospital administrator about Jim. So Jim had a long talk with him, you know, kind of explored the professional possibilities. He brought back a telephone pages, which was kind of interesting because I could look up how many schools and so on. And I gained some information from that. And then we went up together on a Sunday. And we talked to several doctors, but some of them were older and they had nice homes on Grampian Boulevard. We were coming out of a residency with no money and 2 little kids and so on. But we met and talked with a wonderful couple. George Lyon was a neurosurgeon who also had trained at Boston City Hospital. So given that and the fact that he was a specialist was extremely helpful to Jim. And in fact, Jim set up his office in the same building as George Lyon, and they really cooperated very well for many years. Mary Lyon was just really down to earth, and they had 5 kids. And their 2 youngest were good friends of Abby and Slater. In fact, because our apartment overlooked the parking lot of the A&P, she would come over, drop the 2 kids off, the two younger ones, when the others were in school, go do her grocery shopping, come and have a cup of coffee or tea, and it was great. But that first day, she was very helpful. She said, "You wear size 10 shoes, you'll never get them." Mary Lyon was really wonderful, and she told me a lot of things. She said, "You wear size 10 shoes, you'll never get them in Williamsport." Actually, now I wear 11 AAA, which is a double curse. Too long, too narrow, but anyway. And she also said, if you invited doctors to dinner who did not get along well, they would be polite to each other. You wouldn't have to worry that one would stomp out and so on. It was a very fine medical community. We looked into other places, and Jim had said, "Where do you want to live?" We had made the decision not to live in either of our hometowns. And I said, well, Pittsfield, Massachusetts, but they were at that time sending all their stuff to Albany, so there wasn't an opportunity there. Williamsport had and still has, a very high percentage of specialists. It's an excellent medical community. At the time in the city, there were two hospitals, Divine Providence Hospital, run by the Sisters of Charity, and then the Williamsport Hospital. And there was a lot of duplication. Later, they had some kind of melding, but it's, and the, many of the services then went to the Williamsport Hospital. And that is where I had Rebecca Lee Harrison on March 12, 1962, and Burr Stewart Harrison on May 14, 1964. And we spent a couple of years in that apartment. When I was pregnant with Rebecca, I would go look at houses to buy, because by then we knew that we wanted to stay here. And Jim, I think he was about 35 by then. You know, you can't pick up too many times. He had had time in the service, then he had a rotating internship after medical school, and this general surgical residency and thoracic surgery residency. He was about 35 when we came. But, you know, Williamsport was a really great place to bring up kids. It was very fine. We decided to buy a house. I was always hugely pregnant almost immediately. And I looked at a lot of houses, and I said to Jim, you know, I can't fit behind the steering wheel anymore. Either we're going to have to change what we'll pay or what we want or something. And then a house fell into our laps, and it was one, we heard about it by word of mouth. It was wonderful. It had a sun porch right on the first floor off the dining room and the workroom, where the kids could have a playroom right on the first floor, and it had 4 bedrooms. It had 2 baths. We later added some. And just, it was in a nice neighborhood, 2 blocks from the elementary school, maybe about 8 blocks from the junior high school. And then the kids caught the bus for the high school at the elementary school, so even if they were late for activities, they didn't have far to walk. And it was really a wonderful, wonderful house. We lived there for 36 years. I lived there for 6 years after Jim died. He died after an extremely successful practice, specializing in thoracic surgery and some heart surgery. He was very active in innovating things. They didn't even have intensive care units when we moved to Williamsport in 1960. He was active in that, and our daughter Abby, on her 6th birthday, fell off her new birthday bike and had a subdural hematoma, and it was bleeding outside the brain but inside the skin. And so Dr. George Lyon, the neurosurgeon, operated on her and saved her life. But he had a very, very successful practice, And they are still, 18 years after his death, they're still telling Jimmy Harrison stories. He was extremely intense about things. And he was very enthusiastic about things. Not always about the things that other people cared for, but he was very enthusiastic, and he was way ahead of his time on so many things, like the destruction of acid rain. And he was talking about superoxide radicals months before anybody even heard about it. So he was always ahead of the game, and was quite a character, Anyway, the kids went to the elementary school. I volunteered there. And then 11 years after we moved there, a friend of mine, on the basis of just a couple of questions I had asked, encouraged me to run for the school board, which in Pennsylvania is an elected position. There are 9 members. When I first ran, the terms were 6 years, and so that 3 people, that's elections every other year, so 3 people were new each time. Later it changed. The second 2 times I ran, the terms were 4 years, so it meant that 1 year 5 terms expired, and the next 2 years later 4 terms expired. Anyway, I kept saying to her, well, my kids are so young. The youngest is only in 1st grade. And look, listen, it's something that I thought about doing later in life, but I'm just not sure. And I dithered and dithered and dithered. And finally, she said, listen, shit or get off the pot. So I decided to run. And I did run. And it was, to me, it was a very fulfilling experience. I was the only one on the board who spent a lot of time in the schools. And every single year, I went and spent at least a day in every school. And I'd always call the principal to ask if that day was convenient. I don't know whether the principals told their teachers or not. The first year that I ran, the first year that I visited schools, they sent around a pair of scissors to every room. That was the signal that somebody's in the building. But they got used to me. And actually, they got used to me, and they appreciated the fact that I came, and I'd eat lunch with the teachers, and you know, I'd hear things, and things that were good, things that were not so good. They'd show me stuff, tell me things. And a lot of them would say, well, you're the only one we know on the school board. And I really felt that it was important, because that's what it's all about. And of course, in the middle school and high school, your kids don't want you to sit in their classes, so I did try to avoid their classes. In elementary school, they're always glad to see you and so on. But that was a very good experience. We did have 2 strikes. The first strike was excruciating, just excruciating. And it went on and on and on. They did not picket my house. They picketed some other houses. But that was terrible. Going back and that spring to visit the schools was very difficult. But, you know, we all went through it, and they knew that they knew I was their friend, and I knew what it was like in the schoolroom. The second strike was not so bad, but no strike is pleasant. But aside from that, it was really a wonderful experience, and I was on for 20 years. Then, at the end of 20 years, for a variety of reasons, I thought it was time to stop. I really